Hello, BISC1323. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 3-4. We're still in the invertebrates chapter. It's a big one. And we left off last time talking about mollusks, some of their morphological features and basic characteristics. But now I want to talk about some of the classes within phylum Mollusca, starting with class Polyplacophora. So poly means many, and plaque refers to shells. So even if you don't know what a chitin is, looking at one of these, you could see, oh, okay, yeah, it has many sort of plates here on the back as opposed to a single shell that you might see covering a snail or some other mollusk. There are 8 distinctive plates to the shells of these chitins. And, we've got some human hands for scale here. They, do vary in size. And even though these are being held outside of water, they are aquatic. They can exist on dry land for a while. Again, they commonly inhabit tide pools. But, their main environment is an aquatic, specifically marine environment. So these are called chitins. They're marine. 8 plates make up this dorsal shell. And they're mostly herbivores. So don't sweat all the crazy detail labeled here, but we see some of the familiar stuff. There's the foot, there's the mantle, here's the radula, and when we talked about radula last time, it's doing exactly what I said it did. It's using this radula to scrape algae. So yeah, that's all I want to say about chitins in class Polyplacophora. Up next, we've got class Bivalvia. Bivalves include clams, oysters, mussels, also scallops, geoducks, shipworms, but I think I'm just saying clams, oysters, and mussels. They're aquatic. And once again, we've got filter feeders. So, not the first and not the last filter feeder we're going to look at. And because they're filtering particles from the water, they don't have radula to, scrape up food. They're just filtering it out. So if we look at a, perhaps over-labeled figure of a typical bivalve, we could see, oh, there's the muscular foot. There's the mantle, this part of skin. Here's the shell that it has secreted. And yeah, there's a siphon that brings water into the body past the gills. There is a mouth inside of there. Weird to think of a clam or an oyster having a mouth, but there's a mouth and a stomach and an anus, and there's the siphon where the water goes back out again. So classic filter feeding strategy. Some species, I don't know why I always like pointing out eye spots when we see them in weird animals, but some species actually have sensory eye spots. Again, nowhere near as highly developed as our eyes, but some sensory organs able to detect light in a pretty simple way. So that's bivalves. Next up is class Gastropoda. Again, looking at the name Gastropoda, gastro means stomach. And poda means foot, like a podiatry or podiatrist. So what is a stomach foot? Okay, yeah, I guess that checks out. This is kind of just a foot that eats things. So someone thought snails and slugs look like a stomach foot, and checks out to me. So gastropoda is snails and slugs. They may or may not have a shell. Again, snails have shells, slugs do not. And yeah, plenty of these are terrestrial, but there are lots of these that are aquatic as well, either marine or freshwater. So aquatic or terrestrial members. Now that we're getting into things that we're all familiar with, you could see in your common backyard, or maybe you've eaten some of these before, I want to talk about something weird about a pretty common organism, and that is something called torsion. So typically in almost all animals, we have a body plan. Let me just go back to chitins here as an example, where we have the mouth at one end of the body and the anus at the other end of the body. This classic tube-shaped body. Mouth is anterior, if you remember that term, and anus is posterior. Well, in shelled gastropods, their digestive tract has the mouth at the anterior, and here it is going along as normal, and whoops, there is a 180 turn, and the anus actually points anterior, right behind the head, not at the posterior like you would maybe expect. So This only happens with shelled gastropods. Again, this process is called torsion, and the reason for it is not well understood. Some scientists think that maybe wastes would sort of foul up or get clogged by the shell if they came out in this direction, but there are other shelled invertebrates that don't have that problem, and so still some debate as to the why. But what I want you to know is that when we're talking about gastropods, shelled members experience this process called torsion during their development. This is where the anus points forward just behind the head. Okay, couple more classes. Again, this phylum Mollusca is a really big phylum. So a couple more classes. Next up, we've got cephalopoda. Cephalo refers to head, and poda, there's a lot of podas in these names, and we'll see more in the future. Poda means foot, so this is a head foot. Once again, that kind of checks out. What is an octopus but a head with some feet attached to it? So yeah, cephalopoda is octopi, cuttlefish, squids, and nautiluses. Yeah, technically you say octopi if you're referring to, a bunch of individual of those creatures. But if you're talking about multiple different groups grammatically, you do get to say octopuses. We'll see fishes in the next chapter too, and it always sounds weird, but it's technically correct. We've got octopuses, squids, cuttlefish, and nautiluses here in class Cephalopoda. What can we say about cephalopods, though? Well, they may have a shell. Here's the nautilus having a very famous, cool-looking shell, but sometimes this shell is internal, so you don't see it from the outside. So squids, for example, don't look like they have a shell. That's because it's this internal structure called a squid pen. And cuttlefish, similarly, have this internal structure called a cuttle bone, even though it's not technically a bone, it's just a name, that is another sort of internal shell. And sometimes I like what Google pulls up for me when I search for figures like this. I guess if you've got a pet bird, you can buy cuttle bone as a source for vitamins and calcium and stuff. But anyway, this is another internal shell. So, and some don't have any shell at all, so may have a shell, and it is internal in some species. Obviously, all mollusks have a foot. It's really weird in these cephalopods. Instead of being a single structure that sort of crawls around on the ground, the foot is modified to several arms or tentacles. We can see this here. Yep, 8 arms in this case, 2 tentacles in this case, but the number varies depending on what cephalopod we're talking about. But yeah, together these do make up a modified foot. Closed circulatory system. So, I told you the exception would be coming. Mollusks mostly have open circulatory systems. In fact, if we go back and analyze some of the labels here we didn't look at too closely. Here's what the chitin. Oh, hemocoel, spelled a little old-fashioned here, but here's the hemocoel, and there's going to be hemolymph inside of there, and indeed all these other mollusks have an open circulatory system except these cephalopods, which you can see on the diagram here. You've got closed arteries, closed veins, there's a heart, we've got blood vessels here. They're the sort of exception to this. The other interesting thing about cephalopods is in most mollusks, the foot is used for locomotion, for crawling, but in these cephalopods, really they're not flapping these around to swim. They're using their arms and tentacles to grab prey or to grab other things, and sometimes they can walk a little bit on them at the bottom of the ocean, but their primary means of locomotion does not use these arms or tentacles at all. Their primary form of moving around uses something called jet propulsion. So what they do is they take water into their mantle cavity and then expel that water out of the mantle cavity. And it's a physics thing. If you are spraying water out in this direction, to the left as it's labeled in this figure, that's going to propel the animal to the right in this particular figure. So yeah, it's how a jet engine works, but we're just squirting water here. This is how they move around. So they move using jet propulsion. Water is sucked into the mantle cavity and forced out to propel the animal what to us would look like backwards in the opposite direction that water is being expelled. Okay, one more class of phylum Mollusca. Again, I said this was a big phylum. And that's class Scaphopoda. Another poda here. Scapho, I can't think of another English word that uses scaff, but it means boat. And so I guess their body does kind of look like a canoe or something like that. But a more common term for these things is tusk shells or tooth shells. And yep, there's someone holding one of these up for a sense of scale. So this is definitely not the first shelled mollusk we've seen, but the shell is different from the shell of snails or the shell of clams or oysters or chitons. Here, this is a shell that, it's shaped like a tusk, but it's open at both ends. So water can come in, it can be grabbed by the mouth, expelled by the anus, and then propelled back out again. There's your muscular foot. There's some radula for scraping pieces of food. There's the mantle, there's the shell, all the things that all these mollusks are supposed to have. So I'm not going to say much about the details here, just that these Scaphopoda are known as tusk shells or tooth shells. They have a conical shaped shell that is open at both ends. All right, moving on. So now that we're done with mollusca, let's move to our next group here, Annelida. And just to remind you, we are still in Lophotrochozoa, and we're still in Protostomia. So clade Protostomia, superphylum Lophotrochozoa, phylum Annelida. Annelids are segmented worms. This is not the first worm we've seen, but these are finally the common earthworms, night crawlers, classic worms that we're probably most familiar with. It also includes leeches. It also includes plenty of cool looking marine worms that maybe you haven't seen commonly, but these are known as segmented worms. And yeah, you can visually see the bands or the body segments in your good old-fashioned earthworm. So phylum Annelida, these are annelid worms or segmented worms. They've got aquatic members, they've also got terrestrial members. These worms are coelomates. In fact, they were the example of a coelomate back at this slide. Annelid was an example of a coelomate, where there's this body cavity that is located within the mesoderm layer of tissue. So the question is, what is this coelom doing? What purpose is it serving? Well, it serves the purpose, we see the coelom kind of labeled here, as an internal body cavity for fluids. And importantly, these segments, these bands that we see from the outside, are not just an external, visual structure in the skin. These walls, these septations, there's another septum here, actually divides the worm into a bunch of individual segments. Here's another figure showing this maybe a little bit more clearly. So here's one segment, and there's a septum dividing it from the next segment, and there's a septum dividing it from the next segment. Each segment has some fluid within this coelom cavity. So the septa are the walls, and the coelom fills each one of these individual compartments. So what is happening inside of this coelom? Well, there's circulation of stuff, of nutrients and gases. So each individual little compartment here kind of has its own mini circulatory system. So that's the function that the coelom is fulfilling. So the coelom is divided into segments by partitions called septa, and fluid in this coelom fulfills the function of a circulatory system, again circulating things around. But that's not all. You probably noticed here, ventral blood vessel. And these blood vessels running the length of the body. So yes, the coelom helps circulate stuff within each segment, but in addition to that, there's also a classic closed circulatory system that runs blood throughout the length of the worm. So it's kind of like having two circulatory systems. So yeah, all the coelom stuff is true. Also, they have a closed circulatory system. In fact, they were our example of a closed circulatory system, and we already defined that previously. So that helps fill out this table here for annelid worms. They are coelomates, and they have a closed circulatory system. Now, a couple other things to say about them. They've got these bristles called setae on their ventral surface that aid in locomotion. So these are maybe a little hard to see with the naked eye if you ever, pick up a worm and try to inspect it. But if you look closely, you might be able to see these tiny little bristles labeled here, these setae. They just help catch on to the dirt, just help them do their worm thing. Aiding in locomotion is what I'd say technically. In aquatic worms, they're not really crawling around the same way that terrestrial worms are. These setae are part of another structure called parapodia in these aquatic worms. So if I can go back to this, yeah, these are some parapodia on this aquatic worm, which kind of help it, they kind of act like paddles and help these worms swim around. So let's talk, and respiration. I can't forget this. Respiration, they don't have gills, they don't have lungs, they could just breathe through their skin or through these parapodia. And because they got two circulatory systems, it's fine to just breathe in this way. Okay, now there are two notable classes within phylum Annelida, starting with class Polychaeta. Polychaete worms are these aquatic worms. So yeah, here's the bearded fireworm we've been looking at. Some other wild looking members. Love these Christmas tree worms here. But yeah, these are aquatic worms, and they're also known as bristle worms. That's honestly all I want to say about them. Polychaeta means aquatic bristle worms. In contrast, the other group is going to include our classic earthworms as well as leeches. This is going to be class Clitellata. The clitell part of the name refers to this anatomical structure called a clitellum. It's a fused, a band of fused segments, kind of looks like, I don't know, a Band-Aid wrapped around this worm. The function of this clitellum is to aid in reproduction, so it can house eggs and sperm and fertilized eggs and be kind of like a cocoon for young worms to emerge from. Also, fun trivia, the clitellum is always located more anterior than posterior. So if you're ever looking at a worm and want to know which end is the head and which end is the anus, the mouth is going to be the part that's closer to the clitellum. But anyway, that's just fun trivia. Clitellata includes earthworms and leeches, and these worms have a structure called a clitellum. The key terms defines this as a specialized band of fused segments which aids in reproduction. Okay, that's it for annelid worms, and actually that is the last of our Lophotrochozoans. We were in here for flatworms, for rotifers, for ribbon worms, for the segmented worms, and for mollusks. Again, a lot of Lophotrochozoa, but there's one other group within Protostomia that we got to go after next before we can do Deuterostomes, and this is a group called Ecdysozoa. So what's the deal with Ecdysozoa? Well, members of Ecdysozoa have a protective cuticle exoskeleton, a skeleton on the outside of the body that is protective. This is a very effective way to protect yourself by being surrounded by this sort of outer shell of armor. But there's a downside to having an exoskeleton like this. You're trapped by it. Members of ecdysozoa need to molt in order to grow. This process of molting, of shedding the old exoskeleton, is called ecdysis, hence ecdysozoa. And yep, we've probably all seen this before. Here's a cicada emerging from its shell. Molting is something that all of these ecdysozoa have to deal with one way or another. So these are going to be arthropods. We'll get to them in just a few minutes because there is another group of ecdysozoa that I want to start with, and that is nematodes. So just to remind you, we are in clade protostomia, superphylum ecdysozoa, and now we're in phylum nematoda. Nematodes are roundworms, and I promise this is the final group of worms for us to talk about. And so these are different from any of the other worms that we've seen so far because they are much smaller. Nematode roundworms are either microscopic or very small. We're talking about like this a sliver of a fingernail, so barely visible to the naked eye, or microscopic, not visible to the naked eye. There are many notable members here. You don't have to memorize all of these names, but yeah, they cause diseases from heartworms in our pets to pinworms in humans, but there are plenty of other nematodes that are free living, that don't cause any diseases, just sort of crawl around and eat bacteria. So mostly microscopic or very small, and they are pseudocoelomates. So, in fact, to go back to this once again, here was nematode as an example of a pseudocoelomate with this pseudocoelom cavity between the mesoderm and the endoderm. So, what are they using this pseudocoelom cavity to do? Well, they fill it up with fluid and they use it as a hydrostatic skeleton. So here's a typical looking nematode worm. Here's a cross section, and yeah, I've just highlighted the pseudocoel. That's this sort of open cavity inside of the body. And yeah, we talked about hydrostatic skeletons for an earlier group. This fluid is under pressure here inside of this closed cavity, and it fulfills the role of a skeleton, something for the muscles to attach to and to pull off of. Due to their size, again, these things are much smaller than other worms, they don't need any circulatory system at all to move stuff around. They're just small enough they don't need it. So this fills out our table here. Nematodes, pseudocoelomates, and circulatory system, that's an NA, not needed. Now, I want to talk about some of these nematodes in particular, and while it would be tempting to discuss one of these disease-causing nematodes, in my honest opinion, the most impactful nematode of all time is this boring-looking one right here. The free-living one that just crawls around eating bacteria. How is this possibly more important than all the ones that cause, horrible diseases? Well, this nematode in particular, known as Caenorhabditis elegans, usually abbreviated as C. elegans, is a model organism. This is the second time we've seen this term, although the first time was several chapters ago. A model organism is, to read from the key terms, a species that researchers study and use as a model to understand biological processes in other species represented by the model. And yeah, we were talking about yeast and fungi the last time this came up. Mice and rats are classic model organisms, but among all of this, bam, C. elegans. These worms are very popular as models for studying things because they're easy to take care of, they grow quickly, and they're really easy to manipulate genetically. This is a worm that's had all of its neurons labeled with a glowing green protein marker. So you can visually watch their development and see the neurons find one another and form these connections and form these pathways. And neurons are just one example. There are tons of things that these worms do that are things that we as humans do. Again, they're a model for understanding the human body. Even though they're way simpler than a human body, we have neurons, they find one another, we have a gastrointestinal system that, lengthens itself. All these sort of fundamental body things can be studied in a much, much simpler organism that, again, easy to care for, easy to propagate. They're hermaphrodites. And the phrase I'm going to use is there is a robust system for genetic alteration that exists. Again, I won't get into the details, but it's pretty easy to tinker with them genetically compared to other models or other organisms out there. So yeah, great model organism for research. All right, one more ecdysozoa, and that is Arthropoda. So we are in clade Protostomia, superphylum Ecdysozoa, phylum Arthropoda. This is the big one. And when I say the big one, I mean this phylum is way bigger than any other phylum on this entire tree. They all look like the same size here because they're all just sort of rectangular boxes, but consider this. Don't memorize any of these numbers, but consider the number of species in some of these groups. There are about 5,000 species of sponge, maybe 11,000 cnidarians. I said mollusca was pretty big, and that had a little over 100,000 members. But look at Arthropoda, 1.1 million species. That's over 10 times the number of species as the next leading competitor of mollusca. And here's us down here. We're going to be part of chordata. And way more arthropods than vertebrates or chordates. So yeah, this is obviously a huge group, including fleas and spiders and beetles and dragonflies and crickets and scorpions and barnacles and lobsters and some extinct species like the trilobites that we saw when we were talking about history of the world stuff. Massive, massive group, many, many members. So one thing we should be wondering is, why are they so successful? What is it about this group that allows them to have more species than any other group in this tree of life? Well, one of their things is their coelomates. But that's not really the key to their success. We've seen plenty of other coelomates so far, and their coelom doesn't do much. I'm saying reduced coelom function. It only surrounds the reproductive system, so it's not doing anything particularly special. They have an open circulatory system. Again, here is a grasshopper that was our example of open circulatory system. But once again, this is not unique. This is not new. We have seen this before. I'm pointing these out because that allows us to fill out this table. So Arthropoda, coelomates with an open circulatory system. So what is special about them? Appendages, specifically jointed appendages. I'm not talking about little bristles like we saw in earthworms. I'm not talking about tentacles like we saw in a couple of different aquatic groups. I'm talking about appendages with distinct joints in them. These make for a stronger arm or leg or appendage that allows it to bear weight outside of water. We have seen some terrestrial invertebrates so far, but they've all been worms. This allows these invertebrates to exist in terrestrial environments, but actually walk around, to climb, and, as we'll see in just a minute, even to fly. So these appendages are a very basic kind of generic body thing, but they can be modified to do lots of different stuff. And appendage can bear weight in the form of legs. An appendage can be used to sense the environment, called antennae in many groups of arthropods. These appendages can be used to manipulate food, which is huge because it opens up lots of different feeding strategies. And these appendages can also be modified into wings that allow for flight. And yeah, this is the first time we've seen anything fly in Animalia or outside of Animalia. And so yeah, this is huge as part of their success. So another important thing is that their body is broken into segments called tagmata. So they have a segmented body organized into functional units called tagmata. Now, we've seen segments before. Just a little while ago, we were talking about segmented worms, annelid worms, but the difference here is that these segments can take on distinct functions. So here's the head, which has a distinct function of having the mouth and the feeding apparatus and the sensory organs. Here's a thorax, which contains, which is attachment point for these limbs bearing weight. And here's an abdomen containing the reproductive system and most of the visceral mass. And we're going to see slightly different ways to have a segmented body in different arthropods. But yeah, this allows for a lot of flexibility of being able to do this in different ways. Another thing is their chitinized exoskeleton. So, of course, these arthropods are part of ecdysozoa, so they have an exoskeleton. Nematodes technically had an exoskeleton as well, although it wasn't very thick. These arthropods take their exoskeleton a step further and chitinize it. They add this chitin chemical compound that makes it stronger and more flexible, and they still have to molt to grow. That's definitely a downside worth pointing out, but now they have a very robust, very strong, but still flexible exoskeleton strengthened with chitin. Okay, with these basic body features of arthropods out of the way, we of course got to talk about more specific groups. But that's something that we're going to get into in the next one. So in the middle of arthropods, another awkward kind of cutoff, but here's where things are going to end for recorded lecture 3-4.